Hola and welcome to a new episode of the Roofless Dog and Pony Show. This is episode 76. We've taken a little bit of a hiatus because we have been working on some of the paintings that we started since the beginning of 2022, but we're back. We did our summer studies in the past 4 weeks. And now we're back into the routine of proposing a painting collection every 2 weeks. So this is episode 76 of the Roofless Dog and Pony Show. My name is Julio Panisello. I am the dream alchemist at Roofless Painters, a free-range art school, atelier, and gallery for 21st century romantics. With each episode, we reveal the theme of our next painting collection, so you can find out what we will be painting next in the next couple of weeks, and also the reasons why we chose this theme. So this will be collection, I think, number 10, our 10th painting collection of 2022. So we explain where the painting theme comes from and how it relates to our contemporary time. We explore different possibilities for visual representation of the concept, the painting concept, using images of paintings throughout art history as inspiration, while citing stylistic and historical references. Our episodes are like our paintings. They're messy, they're unpredictable, they are unvarnished, and somewhere in between. So not fully complete, but with enough information to perhaps spark some inspiration. You can find all episodes on Instagram, also on our YouTube channel. You can find them, most of them, as podcasts on any podcast platform, whatever you listen to your podcast. If you type the Roofless Dog and Pony Show, you'll see some of the episodes. You are welcome to contact us with any questions or comments about this episode, this presentation, and also if you have anything you want to contribute, any notes you want to contribute to the presentation, any knowledge, any experience, any memory. We'd love to expand our knowledge on the subject, and perhaps you have something that you know that we don't. So as always, we humbly stand to be corrected. So this is also an open call. During the next 2 weeks, the sessions that we're going to host are going to be based on this painting theme, but that doesn't mean that you need to join one of our workshops or sessions in order to create a painting around the theme. You can also use this presentation as an inspiration to study, to research, and perhaps to create a piece of work that you want to later share it with us. So we'll be happy to share it as well. So anyone's welcome to use the theme. And I'm just going to do a little bit of recap. Thanks for being here. So in the past collections, we realized that we did a lot of still lifes. We started with vanitas and then the nightstand, and we've gotten a few comments and requests about creating a portrait. I believe it's been a while since we have done portraits. Yeah, it's been a few sessions. The last collection in which we actually creative portraits was the parents' portrait, and that was a few months ago. So I think it's time to get back to portraiture. It's time to embrace a portrait as a theme. And not only we haven't done portraits in a very long time, but we haven't done self-portraits in way too long. We believe in self-portraiture as a means to not only study and experiment with portraiture, but also as a way to document our changes, to reflect on our current state of mind. Self-portraiture, it's not just physical, it's also metaphysical. So we're proposing to do a self-portrait as the subject and the theme of our next painting collection. We're going to bring one artist, one French artist that we are absolutely obsessed about. let me see if I can find Eugene Carrière. Eugene Carrière, I believe. So we just brought some images. This is a self-portrait by this artist. We discovered, or we stumbled upon this artist a couple of years ago. He's not extremely well known, or well known at all, I would say, or very well known. Eugene Carrière, he was born in 1849 and he passed away in 1906. So he was just on the eve of the turn of the century. His body of work coincided with a lot of interesting artistic movements that happened in the late 1900s. For whatever reason, his work never became as important or as popular as other people's or painters' revolutions at the time. But there's something very peculiar about his work. He used a very limited color palette. He has many portraits that are done with earth tones, with earth colors. And in addition to that, there's a concept that we talk about usually in our sessions, which is edge quality. It's something that we use as a criteria to assess if the edges in our painting are way too similar from each other, or if we need to expand the range and variation of the quality of the edges. So Eugene Carrière used a very sfumato-like edge quality. Things seem to be dissolving. Subjects seem to be behind a foggy sort of like filter. So there's something that we found so enigmatic, so profound, so interesting, so bold at the same time, extremely limited color palette, and very interesting edge quality that we thought we could use the same stylistic premise that Eugene Carrière used in his body of work. We'll show you a few examples, but we're going to start with this self-portrait. This was painted in 1893, and you can tell, or you can see that he used a very small amount of colors to create this very foggy, sfumato-like, very foggy and sfumato-like portrait. So using we're going to show like several portraits to see how specific he was in recreating subjects and how foggy he was in other paintings. But the premise will be for this new collection, self-portraits. We're going to create self-portraits using a limited earth palette and creating a very foggy sfumato-like edge quality. All right, so we'll talk about colors, we'll talk about maybe techniques, but that would be the stylistic inspiration. Thanks for joining the live. The stylistic inspiration behind our next collection of paintings. We're going to take about 2 weeks, but we're going back to portraiture. We are going back to doing a self-portrait. I don't recall the last time we did a self-portrait, but it's something that we do regularly and for many reasons. So we're going back to portrait, self-portraiture, and stylistically we're focusing on this turn of the century or late 1900s French painter Eugene Carrière, who created portraits that have a very limited palette and very interesting edge quality. So this is a self-portrait, and you can see we found very little information about stylistically the process that he used. But we can tell you, I think some of the paintings don't have black, so there is absence of use of very dark colors or black, except maybe some really specific points. What's interesting in this portrait is the intense darkness of the iris and the pupil on the eyes. So everything's done very monochromatically, but then there is this accent on the eyes that it's the darkest part of the entire portrait. detail on the color is a very dark raw umber, but yeah, that's something that's really interesting. He was labeled as a symbolist. He believed in the um, unity, or not the unity, the unity or the nuclear family. So he believed the world revolved around the family circle. So there are a lot of the portraits and subjects are of his family, but we don't see in these paintings. We don't see that he used. Sorry. We don't see that he used white paint. White, when you mix it with colors, changes everything. It alters not only the pigmentation and the value, but also the actual hue of the color. So we don't see any white on these portraits. We're not going to use white on our self-portraits. And let me just move on to another piece. This is, sorry, the live video is on top of the face because it's a very ghostly image. It's a First Communion. It's titled First Communion. We don't have the date, and we collected or we gathered a bunch of paintings by him, but we don't have titles or dates. So it's something that we're going to be working on as we create or as we work on our self-portraits. But this is another example of very limited palette, but if you notice, the earth tones here have shifted to something a little bit more neutral. If there was a hint before on the self-portrait of using perhaps burnt sienna as a base or as a color dominant, a dominant color for the palette, this is more of a raw umber and perhaps ecru. Is there white here? Maybe there is white paint, but perhaps the white paint is being harmonized with the use of like ecru tones, like a really pale or a really neutral, maybe sort of like not even Naples yellow. There's no, in my mind, there's no yellow ochre on the palette. Yellow ochre, it's a great neutral tone, but it can really yellow the neutrals. So we don't see that. We don't recognize that on the palette or on the color palette, so we're not going to use it. So on our color palette, we're going to have raw umber for sure. It's a color that it's a staple color for us. We're going to have burnt sienna because some of the portraits are really warm. And as a substitute for white, we're going to have ecru, also called titanium buff. We like to call it ecru. For whatever reason, I don't know who owns the use of the word ecru, but it's never, no manufacturer uses the word ecru on their tubes when they label them. And that color, this sort of like off-white ecru color, it's ecru, that's what it is, but it's labeled titanium buff. So those are the three main colors that we're going to use. We're going to use combinations of those tones, but we're going to use as the darker tone the raw umber, and as the lighter tone the ecru. So look at the edge quality as well and how the fabric is being painted. It's a blur. It's completely dissolving. There's no linear structure. There's no containment. There's no compartmentalizing on these paintings. Everything's open. The edges are completely smudged and foggy, and again I'm going to use the word sfumato like. So I'm going to move to other works. We have quite a few. This is another example of using a very limited palette. Certainly, if you ask me, this has only one color, just because the transparency of the paint, the burnt sienna, there are a couple of qualities, but the favorite burnt sienna paint that was used, traditionally used, was very transparent, because burnt sienna was the color to transition from sketch to paint. Burnt sienna has always been a preferred color to start painting. So much so that some paint manufacturers have a couple of burnt sienna qualities. One that it's more opaque, and one that it's more transparent, specifically for that first wet sketch. So on this portrait of, we don't know who and what title and what year, but at the end of the 1900s, my take is that only one color was used, and maybe the background was white, because look at the transparency of the paint on the background. It's very thin. There's the only architectural feature right there is perhaps the back seat of the chair in which the figure is leaning on, and also the back seat of the chair that it's cropped towards the right of the painting. There's no indication of corners of the room, difference between floor to ceiling, and everything feels really underdeveloped and abstract. The most opacity on this painting is concentrated on the color area, on the fabric. That has the most intensity, opacity, and darkness of value. But the rest of the painting, it's a blur. It's a transparent, sheer, ghostly blur. We've always been obsessed with this painter, Eugène Carrière, a French painter from the late 1900s. And we're happy that he is not well known, but hopefully this will inspire you to catch any of the paintings of his paintings when you go to perhaps a museum and you see his work. So, as I said, family was very important to him, and he had the belief that the bubble of the family, or everything, revolved around or inside of the bubble of the family. So therefore there are a few paintings of parenthood, in this case motherhood, female figures holding babies. So subject matter pretty much in tune with his beliefs, and also the symbolism that he was labeled. He was labeled as a symbolist painter, so maybe this idea of motherhood or something else, I don't know. But stylistically, I just want to focus on the color palette, the fact that in this painting, again, the architectural, the interior of the room is not a priority. The baby is essentially disintegrating, dissolving. There's a little bit of definition. It looks like a sketch. It doesn't have this idea of a fully formed painting. This could perfectly be the beginnings or the transition between charcoal and first imprimatura stage. It doesn't feel like it's something that it's fully finished, but it is in fact a finished painting, and that's why we love this artist so much. There's some sort of like undertones of maybe cool neutrals on the fabric that wraps the baby, but we're not sure if it's the photograph or exactly what the true colors of the painting are like. But again, this idea of edge quality being so incredibly cryptic and stylistically bold. I wonder what sort of like reception these paintings had at the time in which art critics always had an issue with paintings not being finished, especially because Impressionism, which happened a few years before maybe these paintings, that was the biggest criticism, that the paintings were not finished. So again, we don't have that much, or we didn't find that much information about how the critical reception of his work, but that's another example. So again, we're just gonna go back to this is a portrait. We're gonna go back to portraiture. We're doing a presentation on introducing the next concept for our painting collection, which we will be working in the next 2 weeks. Every session that we will host, whether in person or remote, we will bring this theme, some examples, but the idea is to go back to portraiture, to do a self-portrait, but stylistically get inspired by the body of work of this French painter and do it with a limited earth palette. And we talked about raw umber, burnt sienna, and ecru, but we have other colors that some we have used, some maybe we can introduce for the first time. So another example of this melancholic brown soup of a painting with some gaps between the lip and the skin, some beautiful articulation of shadows or values on the bone structure of the face. And this is what's most interesting on this portrait. It's just the close-up and this idea, the neck completely merging, the shadow on the neck completely merging with the shadow of the fabric, but the bone structure being completely monochromatic, maybe a touch of some gray on the lips. We can only guess, because we wish we had the secrets behind the palette that he used for these paintings. But based on our experience, we can guess that perhaps the lips have a little bit of a gray or maybe some introduction of white paint. And if that's true, see how much it changes the monochromatic harmony of the rest of the colors. When you introduce white, you are changing the color entirely. So I'm just gonna, we have only a few more minutes, but another incredible example of a painting with two figures, a mother and a baby, a female figure, a figure that represents a mother and then a baby, a little bit pulled back, maybe a little bit warmer, but notice the scale, the value scale here. So usually the value scale, depending on how far away the lighter tone or the lighter value and the darker value are, you could have a lot of contrast in which you use really extreme bipolar values, white being on the lighter extreme of the scale and black being on the other one. But when you have a scale of values that it's super narrow, then the difference between the darker and the lighter value on the painting is very close, and therefore there's very little contrast. So this is a perfect example, Exhibit A, of a very small, tiny contrast between darker and lighter, and everything is even foggier. Incredible. Amazing. That could be, again, a stylistic inspiration for our self-portrait. Try not to do something that has high contrast, meaning a lot of distance between lighter and darker, and maybe make it much more tight or tighter. Another example of this is a portrait painting, a female figure or a figure, but not facing forward, from behind, from the back. It takes a second to actually make sense of it because there are no facial features and then everything's completely blurred. But it's another example of this extreme stylistic approach to painting. Completely radical, if you ask us, to whatever was happening at the time. Radical, bold, extreme in its simplicity, super limited, and fantastic in the results. It just we fell in love the second we discovered this artist, again, a few years ago. We've never done anything based on him. We talked about his paintings a couple of times, but we're going to dedicate more time in the next couple of weeks. Again, just going back to the fact that I don't have dates and titles. I think there's a title for this painting, but I don't have it right now. So another portrait, completely monochromatic. I would love to have a time machine and go back and go to Eugene Carrière studio and ask him, or take a photo or look at the palette. I doubt there's more than one color on that palette. I doubt it. And I think the buck stops at 2. Maybe some titanium buff, and a raw umber, period. Yeah, full stop, no more comments. Oh, maybe the fact that, again, the iris and the pupils are very dark. They're the darkest thing. It almost doesn't make sense that they are the darkest values on the entire painting, on a face that has the lightest values on the entire painting. So the high contrast of those eyes with the skin tone, or what represents the skin, it's truly mysterious. Anything, gosh, it just goes on and on. But this, perhaps he is introducing a few more colors on his palette. It's definitely earth-based, but for the most adventurous, if you wanted to incorporate any tones, yeah, of course you can, but we encourage you to stick to a limited palette because it's very good. It's a very good practice. But notice that there's something on the lips of the baby or the child that's a little bit warmer. And there is maybe a distinction between the skin tone. Maybe that skin tone may contain a particle of yellow ochre, and then the hair has more of like a burnt sienna. There are some subtle strings pulled here on the palette, and it clearly shows maybe some grayer notes on the clothes. We don't know. Okay, I'm gonna move to the next painting. Okay, all right. I just made a quick switch. And yeah, I only have minutes. We're hosting a clubhouse room. Maybe I'll just well, you know, there's this landscape, this nocturnal landscape, that it's so abstract. Is it really a landscape? I think it is. It's like a moon landscape. So we guess. But again, the way it's painted stylistically, the brushstroke, the color palette, the pixelation, the smearing of the edge, or the fogging, or the sfumato technique. It's a fascinating translation of a nocturnal landscape in which there is some perspective, but there is some contrast between the sky and perhaps the road or the ground or the canopies of the tree. We've been talking a lot about painting, or painting being in that magical space between the eye and the mind, meaning like there's something in between. It's not fully recognizable. It's the mind that puts everything together, but at the same time there's something there to help you put it together. So I think this is a good example of that space between mind and eye, in which we can recognize, but we have to make an effort to put the image together. Yeah, blown away. So final, any final piece? Oh my gosh, there's so many. Maybe I'll just put this little tiny figure. Composition, very interesting, off-center, closer. So unusual, because usually with something that almost looks like 3/4, you have to put more space between the face and the direction of the face the eyes are looking. But here it's the opposite. He's putting compositionally more space behind, which is unsettling, unconventional. So much to talk about this artist. We only had an hour, half an hour. Please join us. We're starting the webinars tomorrow, Friday, 11 a.m. Pacific time. Anyone's welcome. It's 3 hours, 2 hours painting, 1 hour sort of like exchanging and discussing and showing our work. And we're going to carry on for the next 2 weeks working on our pieces, self-portraits with earth palette, inspired by the work of Eugene Carrière. I try my best. Thanks everyone who joined or who's still here. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you'll get inspired to join and to create a self-portrait with earth tones if you feel too confronted with the idea of self-portraiture, you can do a portrait of anybody, but there are so many reasons why self-portraiture is so good for us. So thank you again, and we can't wait to paint with you in the next few days. Bye.